more of a sandwich shop. And when when I was in college, on a Saturday night, that's where I take my girlfriend. You could get a stuffed crab and took us for like 90 cents, $1.90. And then when I was in college at Dillard, I used to go to Dicker Chase for lunch all the time. On the campus, on Dillard's campus, you could have a hot dog and a Pepsi Cola for $1.25, but for $2 you could go to Dickers and get red beans and rice and hot sausage. So I went to Dicker Chase for lunch with my friends frequently and for supper. And when I graduated from law school, my mother and father and my brother and sister, we all went there to celebrate my graduation.
Can I turn off that television in the
Sure.
other?
Do you want a glass of water?
No, no.
In case we. You're-
You
Should we start?
I'm recording.
Okay, we're here in at 1402 Harriet DeLille Street.
1304.
1304. Let me start over again.
70116.
1304 Harriet DeLille Street in Tremay, at the home of Lolis Elie, with Justin Nystrom of Loyola and Jack Davis talking here.
Let me throw this in. You know, the only street in Tremay named after an African American is that lady.
Is the one we're on.
Right.
And it hasn't been named after her for very long.
Oh, less than 2 years.
Less than 2 years. Well, Lolis, as I've explained to you before, I'm interested in what happened in New Orleans in the 1970s. And I'm trying to test the proposition that this was a decade that in which momentous changes took place, some of which are still affecting life in New Orleans. And the Loyola documentary and oral history studio is interested in collecting materials from the participants, observers, and players from that time, from the 1970s.
It makes sense.
So here we are. But let me just directly ask you from the outset, what do you think was different at the end of that decade than had existed in New Orleans at the beginning?
Oh, we're starting out in the 60s.
Well, we can define the decade loosely.
Good.
I think
I'm
that
better.
makes sense because if you got to go back into the 60s to find the roots.
Right now, I'll get confused at separating the 60s from the 70s at points. I think there've been momentous changes. What I always reflect on, and I say this in other settings like this one, that there was a miseducation among African Americans, and we were trained, not educated, trained to believe that this is the way things are, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. And New Orleans, you always had. I always saw that there were some people who were enlightened, and some people who were willing to struggle for something better, but not to really disturb the white folk. And of course, the way the structure was and is that the politicians were the ones. They were not. The white politicians was not. Their relationship to the ruling classes was not too much different from mine as a boot black. I mean, they just hired help. They were and all.
And you were literally a boot black. When you were
I was shining shoes for a nickel at Broadway and St. Charles. There was a Katz and Best-Off drugstore there at the time. And I had a shoe shine box. And I did a nickel for a shine. Some people would give you a dime. But then, during World War II, you know that big cannon on Ferret Street by Tulane?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was every Saturday, the naval ROTCs would meet there, and they'd have an inspection. And that was the perfect time because there you could get 15 cents for a shine, and most of those young men would give you a quarter. So
But then by the time we got into the 1960s, you'd also been trained as a lawyer at Loyola.
I graduated from law school in 1959, but as I said earlier, before we started recording, I earned my second year, my tuition for the second year of law school at Loyola, shining shoes and waiting on tables and the rest of that.
And then the training, what did the law training do for you as were you better trained as a lawyer than for these other activities when you got into the 1960s and were playing a role in the civil rights movement?
Well, first of all, I never dreamed of being some civil rights person. That was never. I went to law school because I didn't want to spend my life shining shoes. Now, fortunately for me, my first year, two things. My first year in college was at Howard University. And this was in 1953. I was in the Army from 51 to 53. This was in 1953. And Howard University, I mean, that was the hotbed of black intellectuals and for black militancy. And the like Thurgood Marshall and that crowd, they would practice the Brown versus education arguments, etc. I did not attend those sessions, but I knew at least one lawyer who did. But when I came back to New Orleans, it was because I spent all my money I had saved in the Army. And but going from Howard to Dillard was like going from college back to high school. I had 6 years for me between the time I finished high school and the time I started college. And going to college made no sense to me initially because the best teacher I had in high school, which was at Gilbert Academy, which is where Del Cell is now, which is one of the crimes that the Catholic Church committed against black people, was taking that fucking school.
Took Gilbert.
It took Gilbert and put him at De La Salle. And the Jews wouldn't do us that. They were right next door. They never took it in any event. And at the same time that they were doing that, St. Aug was being constructed on an unpaved street on London Avenue. But in any event, in order for my grip on the 60s started in the Army. When I went into the Army, I never had dreamed that I would become a lawyer. I mean, if I had a $2 in my pocket and you offered me $500,000, bet me that I'd become a lawyer, I'd have kept my $2. But being in the Army was very important to me. That's where I met Frank D'Amico. Frank is and was, he and I are still very close friends. Frank is a Loyola law school grad. And Frank and I would go, because Italians weren't too popular with those white boys from East Texas. So Frank and I used to go and have coffee together at the PX. And it was Frank who first suggested to me that I become a lawyer. He was always telling me I was very smart and I should become a lawyer. So I went home one of those nights and wrote my mother a letter and said, if I get out of this Army alive, I'm going to become a lawyer.
And she said?
I wrote a letter, so it wasn't as she said. And that was in 1951, between 51 and 53, but by 59, I was a full-fledged lawyer.
Then so you were in the thick of most of the activities connected to the civil rights movement in New Orleans in the 1960s.
Okay, that's true.
And then we should talk about that as setting the stage for New Orleans entering the 1970s.
Uh,
Where
Well,
did the biggest changes take place in that?
okay.
From the time you got out of law school into the beginning of the 70s, what were the biggest changes?
Well, I mentioned this man up here, Jack Nelson. And Jack, if you want to find an unsung hero from the white community, it would be Jack Nelson. Jack was extremely Catholic, and my friends considered him, after we got to know him, a real saint. My mentor was Jack Nelson,
A lawyer.
a lawyer, very much a lawyer. Jack Jack did something that very few white people did of his generation. Jack identified with the civil rights movement. He didn't just represent people. He was identified with the movement. And at the beginning of the sit-in demonstrations, I ended up with my part. By then, I was in a partnership with Bob Collins, who had been one of the first African Americans to finish at Loyola, and Nils Douglas. Nils and I were the only two African Americans in my class of '59 in Lolis Law School.
And Bob Collins was at LSU?
Bob Collins was the second African American to finish at LSU. There's a funny story here. He and Dutch Muriel started together. Dutch was eager to become the first, so Dutch went to summer school once a semester, and that's how he became the first black.
Well, he became the first a lot of things.
That's very true. I was his lawyer at one of the most crucial times in his life. As a matter of fact, it was the case that put me on the map.
That was the McGrory case?
Daily, no. This was when Dutch first ran for the Louisiana state legislature. Dutch lived in Pontchartrain Park, but this district, Daly, had been occupied by white people all the time. Daly was his opposition, a white man. When Dutch won in the first primary, Daly sued him, saying that he was not in the district. Well, by then, the white folk had decided they was going to let an African American in the legislature. I mean, if you're going to get one, Dutch certainly had no reputation for militancy at the time, now that there are.
Do you remember what year this was exactly?
Shouldn't be hard to come up with that if I think about it. This is in the 60s, that's all I can say. Early 60s, mid 60s, I would guess.
And how did you win the case?
Well, first of all, the judge was Judge Oliver Prevost Carrier, and he's a real Confederate. But his son, Oliver Jr., used to study with me. We used to study together, and that was very beneficial to me. But I always felt that Judge Carrier was a part of a group of people who had decided that it made sense to just let one black in the legislature, because there was no way. It had to be a stretch for him to believe my witnesses, and to believe that Dutch lived in that little funky room up there on Magazine Street rather than in Pontchartrain Park. So this is how. So I got a hold. When I say almost half the black lawyers in New Orleans, only about 10 of us then, were sitting at the conference, including Mr. Turo, was sitting at the table, at the conference table, at the bench during the arguments. So I didn't do this by myself,
Right.
but I was the lead counsel.
So then, before we get to the 1970s, I mean, what was the major ground-setting activity in the 1960s? Was it the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act?
Okay. when I first got to be a lawyer, my office, I opened my own law office immediately, and that was because there were no jobs.
Right.
And I was teaching GIs at the YMCA on Dryden Street. My offices were directly across, later after I finished law school, were directly across the street. The initial boycott, selective buying campaign in New Orleans occurred on Dryden Street, which is now at the Castle Hill Boulevard. A group of men, including Reverend Davis and other ministers and some other civic leaders, they were meeting across the street at the Y. And this is the 60s. Someone there must have said, well, there's a lawyer across the street. Maybe we should get him in here. So I went in there, and that was really my beginnings in the civil rights movement, because that boycott on Dryden Street was a very important event. And a lot of things made it important. First of all, 90% of the business on Dryden Street was coming from African Americans. But they would not hire any African American clerks. And there was precedent for that going up to Harlem in New York. Mm-hmm. The same thing had happened in New York. So we knew that we could beat that. And it turned out that the students from Xavier, Rudy Lombard included, among others, and Oretha, who's at Xavier, and there was Oretha who was at Southern, and a couple of white people, boys, girls, came out there to join in this picketing on Dryden Street.
And which store do you remember?
There were only two stores that we were talking about. Kaufman was the largest one. I'll come up with the second one. And there was H.L. Green. They owned McCrory's. It was the national chain. That was the only person, the only white man in the room who spoke with any sense. He was the one who was early on saying, so what, we should give them jobs. And I became the lawyer for that group. That's why I had my first comeuppance.
And, well, then, it was not long after that that you got the McCrory's sit-in case that went to the United States Supreme Court.
Correct. Now, the person...
Was that a direct linkage from one to the other?
Yes, definitely. Because we learned as we went along. We knew, we had learned of the importance of tourism in New Orleans. That is not something we knew at the time. So when we started, that was Oretha, Rudy, Cecil Carter, Lanny Goldfinch, a white boy, was a part of this, which is a good story. In any event, they started the sit-in demonstrations on Canal Street. And of course, they got arrested. And this is where, by the way, I'm learning how to practice law. I had never imagined I'd be doing that kind of work. But one of my classmates at Loyola was Tommy Nelson, who had been in the Army, and he got out the Army in time to register for the second semester of 56, of 56 or 57. And he was Jack Nelson's brother. We were studying. Tommy started studying with me. We were studying, and Tommy said that he had a brother who had been a assistant district attorney. So we ended up going to Jack's house. He was going to help us, which he did.
With your studies?
With our studies. But right after he got through helping us the first time, he said, well, let's go out and get a cup of coffee. And I said, there's no place in New Orleans that we could go and get a cup of coffee together. Well, that's how rigid New Orleans was. So, but in any event, when Rudy Lombard and Oretha Castle Haley and one other person, whose name escaped me, came to see me about representing them. And by then I was partners with Bob Collins and Mills Douglas. But I didn't have the slightest idea about what it meant to represent these crazy people. Because everybody I had some criminal experience by then, minor stuff. But everybody I had represented, they wanted a lawyer to get them out of jail as fast as possible.
Well, they hadn't yet been arrested for a sit-in at McCrory's, or they were planning it?
They were planning it. Shortly after, as soon as they sat in, they got arrested. But anyway, I didn't have the vaguest idea about how to represent these kids. I never represented anybody who didn't want to come out of jail. And of course, some of these kids, their parents wanted them out of jail. These were all college kids. So that really was my entrance into the more militant civil rights movement. I mean, that's the selective boycott on Dry Street was one thing, but when you start talking about going to sit in, and this in that little funky place at Rosewood, the McCrory's, those places, you know, the only thing that made them important is that black people couldn't sit in with them. That's all the poor white people had. Damn sure weren't from the Boston Club. So in any event, that's how when we that night we was trying to figure out what we were going to do with the sit-in demonstrators. I recalled that I had met Jack Nelson, so I called Jack and asked. After Bob and Nelson and I talked, and I told him, and he shook his head and said, "Well, I don't know." He went and spoke with Father Toomey at Loyola, who persuaded him that it would be a good thing. And of course, Jack became my mentor and my lifelong friend.
So then I don't want to rush through the 1960s.
I will do whatever you say.
But what had improved, or what had changed, or what still needed to be fixed, but at the advent of the 1970s in New Orleans, in terms of race relations and civil rights?
Well, the only place, going to get a cup of coffee, the only place that a white person and a black person could have gone together at that time was the Union Passenger Terminal. And that went on. I mean, everything you could think of was closed. I mean, there were black and white fountains in the federal court. There were black and white toilets in the civil district court. Blacks, in the criminal court rather, blacks had to sit on the last two rows. When blacks went up there to that Catholic church, Holy Name of Jesus, they had to sit on I never did it, but they'd have to sit on the last two rows. Down the street at St. Augustine, now I didn't witness this.
St. Augustine Church.
St. Augustine Church, when you had Easter Sunday and the church got crowded, blacks had to stand up and go back and let the white folk have the seats. And this is what New Orleans was.
Up through? When did all those things start changing?
All of this, they started to change in the 60s.
Now, in terms of if you took it as measurement, if you took a measurement of how many blacks were involved in government or government jobs in the 1960s,
there was none above there was a postman, a postal clerk, but nothing else. There wasn't a single black person working in City Hall without a mop and a broom.
And would you say that the situation changed more rapidly in the 1970s than it had in the 60s?
Well, actually, the big changes came in the 60s, started in the 60s. I mean, the big changes in New Orleans. Now, bear in mind, we were a part of a national movement. Because when we talked about Dry Street, which became Oretha Kelso Hill, by then we had the Congress of Racial Equality, which was a national organization. And we had people from that organization, field secretaries, working with us. And also then, we had these militant, really militant young blacks from around the country. Because this goes right into the freedom rides. And that was, I mean, that was really I want to say the beginning. I mean, the sit-in started it, but the freedom ride, that was a major event.
By the time we got to the end of the 60s, what were the main things that you, if you were taking stock in 1969, say when the mayor's race was taking place, what needed most urgently to be done to fix New Orleans?
Well, first of all, the most important thing was that we had been miseducated to believe that this is a system of segregation and ain't a damn thing you can do about it. The white people had their White Citizens Council, and any elected official had to damn near join the White City Council to have any hope of being elected.
And what caused that to change? Because it did change
Well,
eventually.
my impression that the real change came. You had some minor desegregation by then, but the African American people were changing, and there were some enlightened white people who recognized the fact that we're going to have to either give something up or we're going to have some real problems. That was especially true on Canal Street because we were affecting tourism. And people, those picket signs we had out on Canal Street, the people would not, white people wouldn't go in because they feared there'd be trouble out there. So it wasn't so much that they supported what we were doing, it was that they just feared trouble.
Was the election for mayor in 1969 and 1970, was that a watershed?
This is Moon Landrew?
That was when Moon Landrew was elected.
Oh, that was a watershed to the nth degree. Prior to the time that Moon ran, the black political organizations, Hyde was the sheriff. What they were bargaining for was to get 2 deputy sheriffs. Okay.
That was their ambition.
Well, that's the best. They were just hoping to get some power. Was considered power at the time. And by then, you had a couple of blacks on the police department, but they couldn't arrest white people. So here, the smoke has been lit. But now when Moon comes along, I mean, Chuck Morrison was considered enlightened. I mean, his biggest reputation was that he had never said nigger in his life. That was a word he had never used.
I guess that was something at one time.
Well, but in any event.
What kept Chet Morrison from pushing racial equality?
Oh, that wasn't even a word in Chet Morrison's vocabulary, racial equality. He was, bear in mind, Chet defeated Maestri, the old regulars, the old long organization. And for whatever reason, get Chet again, he didn't talk about the niggers, unlike his predecessors. So he was considered to be enlightened. Now, when Moon comes along, I mean, Skiro was, it's sad to say, but, well, I'll come back to him later. But anyway, no, when Moon Landrew comes on the scene, Moon has agreed that he's going to put 2 black people at the head of department in City Hall, which he did. And Moon delivered a lot more than he had promised.
As measured by what?
Well, he
More
appointed,
jobs or?
well, not just jobs, but Terrence Devaney became the chief administrative officer under Moon. And when Moon became chairman of HUD, he took Terrence on as his deputy.
Why did Moon do it and Morrison and Skiro didn't?
Well,
What
Moon
made
just,
it possible? Was it the person or was it the circumstance?
I think both. I think both. I mean, Moon did not come up. Now, Moon will tell you today that he was a recovering racist. There were damn few white people weren't crazy who were not racist in New Orleans. But Moon did not come up in a racist household, and Moon came up in a community where blacks and whites lived next door to each other. And, Moon came up at least as poor as I was. And Moon's religion played a role in this. I mean, the fact that he was Catholic, he saw things that he considered to be not fair.
And did he want to undo the unfairness?
I remember the day I met Moon, long before this. The two people I met, the two white boys I met, were both at Dillard. Moon was in the legislature. Jimmy Davis was the governor then. This is before Moon ran for mayor.
This is the early 1960s.
Right. Moon and Mike O'Keefe. I became Mike Sawyer at a point, by the way. Moon and Mike O'Keefe came to Dillard to talk. And McCarthy, the anti-communism was the biggest thing then. And Moon took the soft side. Moon said, look, if you have to discuss communism, whatever, do it, but I can't protect you. And that was unlike what Mike was suggesting, do anything you want and I'll be on your side, which was bullshit. But in any event, that's the first time I had interacted with Moon. And what I was impressed with was that he's in the legislature, he was a straight talker. And the racists had their own Baton Rouge. And then, I mean, this is the days of Jimmy Davis. That was my first introduction to Moon, which was long before. I was still a student at Dillard at that point. I was like my second or third year in college.
In the mayor's race in 1969, I believe you told me earlier that you were a friend of Billy Gust, who was running for mayor. And you ended up supporting
Moon. I remember to this day the way that came about. Billy Gust was not considered a racist. Billy Gust, so I had pretty much signed on with Billy Gust, and we were going to a meeting at the Labor Union Hall, and Billy Gust told me something having to do with something like, well, Lolis, I want you to know I'm running for office, I'm not running for civil rights, etc. And my reaction to myself was, I know the difference. Well, I walked out of that, at the end of that meeting, I was in Moon Landrew's camp. Oh, Moon Landrew did something very smart. Moon came and got me, and he took me to the neighborhood on Adams Street where he was read, and where he was living.
The neighborhood where he grew up on Adams.
Right, on Adams Street. And Moon said that, and then he took me to Rosa Park, which was where Billy Gust was from. And Moon said, now, which one of these white men do you think would be the most beneficial? And that's where Moon and I started our relationship.
And did you start supporting him at that?
100%. Oh, I was very, very much into supporting Moon.
So we had 8 years of Moon Landrew as mayor.
Right.
What, in terms of the things we've been talking about, social justice and race relations, what was accomplished in that 8-year period?
Well, at many levels, relationships among blacks, well, you got the Voting Rights Act. And this tampered down a whole lot of racism. I mean, these white politicians knew they had to get black votes. And I still believe that the most important right we gained during the Civil Rights Movement was the Voting Rights Act. And that's why it disturbs me to no end that these fucking people are going back dealing with that, and it ain't coming from the South. I mean, it started out in Pennsylvania, voter suppression. I mean, that's a serious threat.
And as more African Americans got registered to vote, the traditional organizations in New Orleans, like the RDO and the CCDA, lost their clout to
No, they
other organizations, or to the,
well, they didn't lose their clout completely. That man I mentioned earlier, Ernest Wright. Ernest Wright was never with Chuck Morris, and he was with Earl Long, going back probably to Huey Long. So Ernest Wright identified with the RDO as opposed to Chuck Morrison's CCDA. And of course, the difference was that the racist language that was being used was never a part of Chuck Morrison. He was as racist as any of the rest of them. But Earl Long was, his attitude was, he was willing to give you Lincoln Beach, but he wasn't going to support anything that gave you the right to go to Pontchartrain Beach.
now do you think by the time Moonlander was running for mayor in 1969 and 70, and then
Jimmy Fitzmaurice was in that race.
yes, yes, and was the motivation for him to be more inclusive and open to African Americans, was that because of he thought it was the right thing to do, or was it because he realized that there was going to be an increasing number of African American voters?
I think some of both. I think he was very comfortable and very happy with the fact that things were getting to be looser and people were becoming more enlightened. But he was, he's a politician. He didn't overlook the fact that if he played the game different, he could get elected, and up to and including all those land rules are really indebted to him for what he did then.
Yeah. What do you in terms of the city's healthy growth in the 1970s? What were the accomplishments of the Landrieu administration? I mean,
Well, just you could breathe fresher air, I guess. But by now, I had talked earlier about blacks having to stand up on the amount to hold the name of Jesus Church in places like that, and some of the most worst parts of it. A lot of these for colored only signs are coming down. So Moon is coming in at a time that blacks are becoming more and more militant, and more blacks are getting registered to vote. And more blacks are, willing to fight for some power. That was Moon. So those two things came at the same time.
if it had been Jimmy Fitzmaurice in 1970 as mayor, what do you think would have happened?
Well, that's a good question, and there's a good answer to it. Jimmy Fitzmaurice ran against Vic Skiro. During Skiro was running for a second term. Because Chuck Morrison had become the American ambassador to the Organization of
American States.
Right. And the city council had appointed Skiro. Moon was not in that fight. Fitzmaurice was running against Skiro. And we were all the black people were in favor of Skiro, including me, and many of us were with Jimmy Fitzmaurice. We all opposed Skid Row, because he was as old regular could be.
You were all for
We were all for Fitzmaurice
yeah.
against Skid Row.
Right. Then this is the 1965 election.
You pick it. That's what it
Yeah.
was. It was Skid Row running for a second time.
Right.
They, Moon and Mike O'Keefe, among others, had a meeting at the Howard Johnson on Lowell Avenue with blacks and white political people. Jimmy Fitzmaurice, to a direct question, what would he do different? What would he do in race relations? And his answer was that he thought we had wonderful race relationships in New Orleans, and he would do exactly what had been done in the past. So then everyone lost their breath. So then they called a little recess in the meeting. And Jimmy Fitzmaurice comes back in the room, and the same question is put to him, and there's the same answer. At that point, many of us, including me, say, well, we'll be better off with Skid Row for one more time than we'd be with Jimmy Fitzmaurice. So Jimmy Fitzmaurice lost it all with black people at that point.
Do you think he would he have been capable of governing a city that was largely African American if he'd been elected in 1970?
Well, Moon had a lot more education than Jimmy Fitzmaurice. I mean, Jimmy Fitzmaurice had nothing going for him, but he was a bullshit artist. He wasn't as educated as Moon. He didn't have the heart that Moon had. He was not as intelligent as Moon, by far.
Let me shift a little bit. One of the things that, besides the Landrieu administration, that took us through the 1970s was the rediscovery that New Orleans had a culture that that other people were interested in, and people who lived here were interested in. I'm talking about the food and the music, architecture, all of which are largely African American in influence and origin.
Yeah.
Was that a way of fighting back against this segregation?
You mean were they white people who recognized that?
Well, the fact that people in New Orleans recognized
Well,
it too. That
but the people in New Orleans, we did not have a really serious educated class of white people who were socially conscious or were cultured. I mean, just look at the Mardi Gras, and where do you find culture there? Putting on some bunch of fucking floats, but you could do that in New York. They had no regard for the music.
You didn't have too many people like Thomas Sankton taking his son to listen to jazz musicians.
All right, who was that?
Thomas Sankton was a novelist.
No, I didn't know him.
Yeah.
No, the people who came here to promote black culture and to save the French Quarter were mostly Jews, people like Larry Bernstein, and with Preservation Hall and that stuff, and the whole idea of the Jazz and Heritage Festival did not come from local white people. It came from George Weah. So we had, again, we had the white people here, the only culture they knew was Mardi Gras. They were not people who had any serious, they didn't recognize what jazz music meant.
Would you agree with me that jazz music in the 1970s got a lot more attention than it had, whether it was from outsiders or locals?
Oh, that's very true. And, New Orleans had not recognized the genius of the Louis Armstrong. I mean, he was just a clown up there. So they didn't, white people did not, nor did black, understand the cultural significance of the music. I mean, that has changed radically.
And the benefit, what were the benefits of discovering a different attitude about the music?
Well, people become cultured and more enlightened. And it was, New Orleans, the food and the music. And white people have always danced to black music. And if you went back on the plantations during slavery, whenever there was a need for entertainment, there was some black coon show or something.
Yeah.
That's what they had. So you had, it's hard to explain.
Was the rediscovery of the music, if I can put it that way, was that dependent on the civil rights movement opening people's eyes?
Yeah, those two things were happening at the same time. And you had here for the music, there was on WWL there was a program called Moon Glow with Martin. And all of the progressive music, much of the progressive music was being played on that station at night on WWL. So that was the only, there was that.
Was that New Orleans music, or was that?
Oh no, that was national.
Progressive jazz from.
That was
the world?
national.
Yeah.
That was national. The only thing you had here with New Orleans music on the radio was WBOK that had jazz at 5/5, like a half an hour of serious jazz music.
So what caused the jazz festival to take off from its first appearance in 1970 to being as big as it got in the 1970s?
The name there is going to be George Wein, who I'm proud to say is a friend of mine. Oh, that's who that was. I mean, that local, and I got this directly from George Wein. One of the major people who helped with the Jazz Fest was when the Times-Picayune endorsed it. That was major. And that was George Wein told me that was the biggest contribution that the Times
Boosted the audience?
well, it boosted the argument, legitimized it, and, just let people know. He had done the Newport Jazz Festival before he came here, and he was a jazz musician. George Wein was, so you have all of those things were coming together.
And New Orleans discovered that it had all these different strains of music,
And food.
many of which could justify a separate stage of the many stages at the Jazz Fest.
All right, absolutely. I mean, the Jazz Fest, in terms of cultural events that bring money to New Orleans, the Jazz Fest does almost as well as Mardi Gras.
And simultaneous with that, New Orleans was becoming much more food conscious than it always had the food, but it was now talking about it more overtly. Was that a function of the civil rights movement? Was that a function of the same?
This is one I paid some attention to. You should start with this cookbook, the Times-Picayune cookbook, where they said
The classic, going back to the early 20th century.
we have to learn. These old black people are dying out. We have to learn how to do this. When my friend Rudy Lombard wrote his cookbook, there was no such thing as damn few white chefs in New Orleans. Matter of fact, Billy Gus told me this. When Antoine's restaurant paid their cooks $1 above minimum wage.
And they were called cooks.
Cooks, so that chef came with the white folk. And Rudy's cookbook. When Rudy wrote his cookbook, no one could name a half dozen white chefs in New Orleans.
And his cookbook was in Creole Feast.
Creole Feast.
Was in the mid-1970s, I believe.
I think you're right. I have it back there. I could get that.
But the food in New Orleans was being prepared by people who were following the traditional African-American Creole recipes for the most part.
Absolutely.
And which had been codified in the Times-Picayune cookbook.
Well, that's an important book.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more honesty in that book than you'll find in many aspects of New Orleans culture.
In giving credit to the sources, you mean.
Right.
And capturing the culture that produced it. But why, then all the chefs that came up, it seemed there were a lot of white writers and chefs in the 1970s who seemed to jump on the wave of New Orleans food and take full advantage of it.
That's very true. That is what you said there is just absolutely true. I mean, you know, you had I mentioned Billy Gusser earlier. His grandmother started Antoine. She was cooking and bringing food out to the boats, to the ships. So this was, you know, gradual. And New Orleans, you know, again, we have not had, for the most part, an enlightened ruling class.
Well, how does that apply to food then?
Well, at every level. I mean, what do you? If I'm right, that two of the biggest things in this city is the food and the music.
Right.
So to be enlightened on that, I mean, we gave up the Port of New Orleans. You know, Houston came out. I have an article I'll share with you.
So the port declined.
Right.
What we're left with, and the oil industry eventually went away in the 1980s. But we're still pretty strong in food and music, you would say.
Well, we're strong. We're stronger now
And does
than
that mean,
ever before.
do you think the 70s started that kind of surge that caused the food to be as visible and a central portion of our life as it is now? The same with the music?
Well, no, I'm speculating. I would say yes, but at the same time, you found a lot of people moving to New Orleans from other places, both white and black. And most of these white people coming here, I mean, they recognize the value of the food and the culture much more than the natives.
And they adopted it.
Right.
They took up the New Orleans cultural traditions
Right.
and preserved them.
Well, and promoted them and recognized the value of them and saw the money that could be made from them.
I remember Richard Collin writing about
Well, I have his book over there.
writing
The Underground Gourmet,
and,
right.
and it was the first really comprehensive journalism about restaurants and food, and that started in the early 1970s.
Oh, that was right. And that was a very important book. By the way, it destroyed an important black restaurant, like Chelsea because Austin Leslie was a wonderful human being. He's no longer with us.
He was the cook.
Well, he owned the restaurant, but he thought rather than stick with the New Orleans food that the black community knew, he thought he could do what Antoine's was doing, which, you know, so he just, he couldn't compete with the French Quarter restaurants by any stretch.
Yeah. He certainly got a lot of attention from all of those local and national food writers.
Right, well, they got that, well, there was a television program that started and ran a long time. What was it called?
Was that Mrs. Richard?
No, Lena Richards. No, that's another important.
Frank's Place.
Oh,
That's Frank's Place.
the
Right.
fictional show.
Right,
Right.
right. Well, that was based on
Right.
Chelsea.
Have we kept, if we hadn't started paying attention to the food and the music in the 1970s, would we be as far along with it as we are now?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's almost an impossible question to answer. But I don't. I think now, you know, that you can go. There are not many places in America where you can go hear music in as many venues any night in the week as you can in New Orleans. Now that's and the restaurants here tend to get better and better. Unfortunately, they have dropped in some of the best kind of food they were making, but these restaurants in New Orleans.
And what about this consciousness of the urban landscape as something that's valuable in New Orleans? I mean, the preservation movement, or the preservation of neighborhoods and architecture, kicked into high gear in the 1970s after preservation had touched only the French Quarter in terms of official regulations up till that point.
Oh yeah, there's a book you'll enjoy if you haven't read it, called Lost New Orleans. I mean, you had the houses in Tremé. That was the mansions like damn near like St. Charles Avenue. New Orleans people here, even my friend Moon was perfectly prepared to run the I-10 through the French Quarter. So, you know, we never have had an enlightened ruling class. The Boston Club didn't give a shit about culture.
Tell me about Interstate 10. Interstate 10 comes down Claiborne Avenue and changes a boulevard, an Oak Line Boulevard, into an elevated expressway.
Which is criminal.
Would that have happened 10 years later? This was a mid-90s.
Oh no, I don't think it would happen 10 years later. I mean, you had more oak trees and on that curve here in New Orleans than in between here and Oakland, California. I mean, that was just, no enlightened people would have done that. And of course, nobody in the black community, which is where all the black businesses were, no one stood up against
All the black
that.
businesses on Claiborne Avenue mounted no protest?
No protest
in the
was,
late 90s?
right, and Chuck Morrison is the mayor.
And the trees came down under Victor Skiro.
Right.
Um,
And I attend camp.
and it severed Tremé from itself.
Right.
I mean, we're actually only, 5 blocks now from the elevated Interstate
Right.
10.
Exactly.
So despite the harm, I mean, was the consciousness of architectural and neighborhood value in the 1970s, did that help Tremé, or was Tremé just going to get picked on by all these other sources? I mean, we have Armstrong Park.
But what you also had, now I'm looking at it from a black perspective, black people were rushing out to New Orleans East. Okay. I mean, the blacks who started making a little money, they were building these, going to the East. Most of the people who live in Tremé now are white, and for damn sure the people who are buying up Tremé are the white people. They're just, I mean, there are only 2 black people in this block, one on this side and one on the other side. And this block here, the Bynums, when I moved around here 25 years ago, those were slums, literally. And except for Bynum, who owns a lot of property around here, most of the people buying property in Tremé now are white people, and that's been true for a long time.
And in the 1970s, what was Tremé as well regarded as it is now, as a place of history and texture?
I don't think so. You know, and I'm straining to
We were just in the 1970s. New Orleans was discovering all kinds of neighborhoods, from Marigny downtown to the Lower Garden District and beyond uptown. Did Tremé get left out of that?
Yeah, well, anything, Tremé was not. You did not. Even during Moon Landra's time, Tremé was just destined to become a slum community. Like a more painful part on this subject would be the 7th Ward, which is where all the Creoles were, and not all, but many. And these were the carpenters who built those mansions on St. Charles Avenue. And you take a look at what they were building for themselves. And again, you know, and some of this, we talked about slavery earlier, but we were not that far away from slavery. And that continues to haunt us.
Can I ask you another urban landscape issue?
Connects me. to
Armstrong Park affects Treme.
Right.
It was intended, I think, by the Landrieu administration to make up for the damage that had been inflicted by the demolitions that had occurred under the Skiro administration for the most part, for the cultural center that never happened.
Well,
But do you think that was a sensitive plan or a good plan?
it was not good and it wasn't sensible. And if you talk to Moon, now bear in mind, as much as I respect Moon, and I respect him to the highest, but I mean, Moon was not culturally educated by any stretch. And Moon got two people, and Armstrong Park is a crime. That fucking fencing all around Armstrong Park, that's there to keep the little Louis Armstrongs out. But if you took a look at Lost New Orleans, you'd be amazed at the property that was destroyed there. I mean, I'm glad to have it.
But by the previous administrations, would you agree?
What?
The demolitions took place before.
Much of that came during Moon. I think Louis Armstrong Park came during Moon. And he had gotten, who was it? He was the editor of the Times-Picayune and Dutch Muriel. He got to advise him.
Charlie Ferguson.
Charlie Ferguson.
Then the state's item.
All right. Well, that's so Moon again. Moon certainly didn't know nothing about jazz other than probably.
You said that in the previous decade, New Orleans ruling class treated Louis Armstrong like a clown.
Right.
And here we were now at least had the impulse to dedicate a memorial to him. It turned out to be a part.
It's the same thing with him as with Mahalia Jackson. I mean, but he had made an international reputation by the time Armstrong Park came along. And now the music is being imitated all over the world. And you got these young people who the Marcelluses are the best. And the people who realize Noka, which is where both of my kids went, and you would get into, and you had a Ben Franklin, that was the only public school at the time in New Orleans we're talking about. New Orleans, and I mean, Ben Franklin and Noka.
The New Orleans Center for the Creative Arts.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, both of my kids went there.
But now, on the question I'm not getting out very well about Armstrong Park is that, generally speaking, Landrieu era was helpful to the quality of life in many New Orleans neighborhoods.
Yeah,
but Armstrong Park was not helpful to Treme.
Oh, Armstrong Park is not a part of Treme. They put that fucking fence up there to keep the residents out of the park. I mean, I used to, when I rode my bicycle, I'd ride my bicycle be in Armstrong Park, and some security person would tell me I couldn't ride my bicycle in there. I could ride it in the auto park.
Now, you mentioned Dutch Morial as being one of the people advising on Armstrong Park.
Right, and that's history. Dutch Morial and Charlie Ferguson.
Tell me, we didn't talk about Dutch Morial as mayor, but we couldn't leave the 1970s without talking about the beginning of the Morial administration. Do you think it accomplished significant things on top of what had been built up in the 60s and 70s?
No, I don't. And I think that I'm reminded of the fact that at a point I was Dutch's lawyer.
Right.
I think Dutch did some decent things, but I don't think that Dutch was very much into culture. I don't think that Dutch recognizes enough. I don't think anyone ever considered Dutch to be a jazz fan. Come close. Now, Dutch did pay attention to food. I'll give him that.
Yeah. What about continuing the inclusive moves that the Landrieu administration had been making about including the African American community in political life and government?
Oh yeah, but I mean, once Moon did that, And once you got that, and you got it more and more people, you know, getting to be, oh, getting to be office holders and winning the elections. That to me has been the way what we've gotten generally out of our our African American politicians is a gross embarrassment to me. I don't find enlightened leadership there at all.
So you think Moon had the hard part of the breaking down the barriers?
I think so, and I think as a consequence of the Moon, I think white people the white rulers were they were expecting more militancy from the African American politicians. Uh, And that's a sad story. It's a very sad story.
So I keep wanting to frame this as about the 1970s. By the time we got to the end of it, what were the best things, or the best thing that had happened?
Well, I mean, it was a desegregated city in many parts. I mean, many of it is as segregated now as it ever was. Uh, but but what you got, it was a more open city, much more open. And we are still in many parts very backwards. But New Orleans is no longer as much of a racist city as it was.
And have we been able to build on that over the last 30 years since the 70s ended? Or are we not making any advances?
Well, I think that the fact that we're making some advances, I think is undeniable. On the other hand, we had such a long, hard way to go, given what we had, and we still do not have an enlightened ruling class in this city.
And what were the worst things that happened in the 1970s? What?
The worst things with the police, with then and now, police brutality. I mean, that's rampant, and an awful system of public education. I was, for a brief while, I was the attorney for the school system. It's an extremely sad story. I mean, you have, you go back from slavery, you have no desire to educate a majority of the population. And for many of us, including me, gained a lot as a consequence of the Civil Rights Movement, but for many, if not most African Americans, the Civil Rights Movement didn't touch them. Many then, as if you go to Galatoire's at 12 o'clock on a Friday, you're going to see a bunch of black people in there.
And so by the end of the 70s, we really hadn't made any gains in the educational system or the police brutality system.
Well, certainly not in the police brutality, but there were gains for the few. I think, I mean, a little myopic, but I look at some of it and look at my children, both of whom got a superior education in New Orleans. But that is not true for the most black people. And the public schools here are still awful. I mean, I think it was Mitchell Andrew who said, that kids more apt to be killed at John McDonald than in Vietnam.
Well, we said we'd confine this to an hour if we could, and there are plenty of things we could talk about, but I want to thank you for doing this, and it's been really.
Well, as you know, I've always respected you, and it's why and also we were talking earlier. I enjoy reading history and things like that, and I just feel that insofar as I can add to it and someone some years back take a look at this and tell them where we are.
Well, I think this is really helpful, and this will fit really nicely into the project. Justin, did you have anything else that you want?
Can I just ask?
Please.
If I could sit, I'll be over here, so I can, not to prolong but I wanted to ask you, did you and Rudy Lombard discuss when he decided to write that book, Creole Feast?
Did we discuss it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my secretary in my office typed it. Yeah, Rudy and I, 100%. No, it was all Rudy's idea, and Rudy had went to Mr. Burton, who generally is believed to be the best chef we ever had. But Rudy's idea, and the way it started. Every time Rudy and I were going to all these fancy restaurants, and every time he would say the same thing. He'd say, "Lolis, I bet there are black people in that kitchen." And that was always the case. And that's where Rudy developed his idea about the Creole Feast. And he got a whole lot of, and Rudy he did this for one while. He had a Creole Feast, and he would invite all the chefs, and that caught on for a while. And then Rudy moved to California.
Did you know most of these chefs, or
Oh, absolutely.
what can you tell me about Henry Carr?
I'd have to get. He was at that place on Napoleon Avenue. What is that Italian restaurant on Napoleon Avenue?
Pascal's, Manali's.
Manala's. I think that's where Henry Carr
I
was.
believe so, yeah.
Oh.
I understand Nathaniel Burton was quite an individual.
That man did more with food in terms of just sitting around having a meal than anyone else I've ever known. I mean, he was the it of it. I mean, he was it. He was a super chef.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Too? Why then didn't they get called chefs?
Well,
How did they manage not to get that
because
designation?
you could pay a whole lot less to cook than you could to a chef. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, they were not, the people in these restaurants, from going back to Billy Gus, and $1 above minimum wages at Antoine's. I mean, you start starting chefs, and they got those big hats on, they're going to demand, they begin to think more themselves. And as a consequence of that, they have to start making some demands.
Well, why was it white chefs, a lot of them new to town, who sort of cornered the market on that title? Why couldn't any of the black cooks, who were just as good, or leverage themselves into being chefs?
Well, that's a good question, but I know the answer to it. I mean, they had not thought that far. They hadn't thought that far, and that wasn't true just with the chef. It's a good example of it, but the truth is, I mean, you know.
And that's still largely the case.
Now, you mean chefs?
Mm-hmm.
Well, most of the chefs in New Orleans are white now.
Mm-hmm.
And when Rudy wrote his cookbook, you needed to really go through something to find a white chef in New Orleans.
I actually made my students read that cookbook. And
The Creole Feast?
the Creole Feast. And then I told them, as a research assignment, tell me what happened to these people. And they worked very hard, and they found little bits and pieces. And that book came out in 1978. What happened to these people?
Well, Stanley Jackson, well, those that are still alive, I mean, there's one guy was a major chef. He decided he wanted to be a policeman. Austin Leslie, Mr. Burton died a long time ago. Most of these people either died or left town. I can't think of about the only person who's from those days who's still around is Leah Chase. I can't think of anybody else who's still around.
What was it? What were the? I mean, we know Leah Chase and Dookie Chase's was really important during the Civil Rights Movement.
True.
Do you remember the first time you walked in the doors there?
Oh God, yeah, I used to go there every day for lunch when I was in college. I mean, I could go and get lunch at Dookie Chase, say for $2, and stay on the campus for $1.50, hot dog and a Pepsi Cola. So a group, me and my friends, we went to Dookie's on a regular basis, and that on a Saturday night when I was taking my girlfriend out to supper, it was always Dookie Chase.
Did you ever find yourself in Aretha Castle Haley's mother's kitchen?
Oh, absolutely. I was there, or at the Castle Hill, and I would have lunch 2 or 3 times every week, breakfast once or twice a week. And her husband, Richard Haley, was a major mentor of mine. Richard came here to coordinate the Freedom Night, which is where he and Aretha met. Yeah, but I was often at Aretha's house. Aretha's sister was one of the best barbecuers in the town. And Richard cooked often. And by the way, Aretha was a hell of a cook. She didn't cook often, but she was a hell of a cook.
And her mother worked at the restaurant.
Oh, her mother worked at Dookie Chase till she died.
Yeah.
She's a barmaid at Dookie Chase.
What did the inside of that kitchen look like?
Too small, much too small. It's very small. Not enough room in that kitchen for 3 people.
Did you ever get thrown out because you'd been there too late?
Oh no, no one got thrown out. As a matter of fact, I was going there before Leah Chase was there. The old man, Dookie Chase, had been a lottery vendor. We'd be in there till late, and he said, well, I'm not locking the doors because I don't want no people to come in. I'm locking it because I don't want you all to go out. That was the old man Chase, yeah.
That's great. I could probably ask another 5 dozen questions, but I feel like, I guess I'll stop myself right here. I'll make my analogy off the tape.
All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you
This
very,
was
very
really,
much.
really helpful.
I hope it's been helpful.